They said Singapore was too small, too poor, and too broken to survive. In the 1960s, it was a land of slums, unskilled laborers, and a crumbling economy. No one believed this tiny island had a future, but today it's one of the richest nations on Earth, with a GDP per capita that rivals the greatest economic powers. How did Singapore defy the odds and rewrite its destiny? This is the incredible story of how Singapore became insanely rich through controversial policies.
Every time we look back on this moment when we signed this agreement which severed Singapore from Malaysia, it will be a moment of anguish. For me, it is a moment of anguish because all my life,
right now, you're looking into the eyes of a man who believed unity was the solution, that an alliance with his neighboring countries could propel Singapore out of the turmoil. But instead, in 1965, the Federation of Malaysia decided to expel Singapore from its territory, a devastating fact of history which left him absolutely speechless. On that day, he pulled himself together, went back to his office, and set out to do the impossible. This man was Lee Kuan Yew, the member of the People Action Party and the first Prime Minister of the Republic of Singapore. By 1965, Singapore had gone through the British colonial era, the Japanese occupation during World War II, and the expulsion from Malaysia. And after all this, there was a lot of damage to recover from. The city center was overcrowded, and the buildings were in a state of disrepair. The economy was reliant on trade, with almost no local industry to provide jobs for the expanding population. As a result, unemployment remained above 10%, and almost 70% of the population lived in slums. The new nation faced enormous challenges due to its lack of natural resources and hinterland. However, these Singaporean leaders would go on to implement policies and regulations that would be hailed as the greatest economic miracle in history.
the next 1,000 years, we will be here. But people like me and like my friends here tonight will be here. Recognizable, identifiable.
Roughly 3 decades after achieving independence, Singapore's economy evolved from a semi-closed, low-wage producer of mainly labor-intensive goods to a very open, high-wage producer of high-tech, capital-intensive products. To understand how this happened, we need to look at 4 different phases of economic policy. The first phase was between 1959 and 1965. During this time, Singapore was focused on something called import substitution. This meant trying to make things in Singapore that they used to buy from other countries. To understand why, we have to note that Singapore's traditional strength was in trade, but that was starting to decline because other Southeast Asian countries were trading directly with Western countries. So Singapore needed a new plan. Their first idea was to team up with Malaya, which led to the creation of Malaysia in 1963. This was a good move for Singapore because it meant there were suddenly a lot more people to sell things to, which automatically doubled Singapore's market in terms of GDP. To help local businesses, they used tariffs and quotas. Tariffs are like taxes on goods from other countries, and quotas limit how much of something can be imported. By May 1965, some 230 commodities were subject to import licensing and quantitative restrictions. This made imported goods more expensive, making people more likely to buy things made in Singapore. The government also provided tax breaks to encourage companies to manufacture things in Singapore and invest in industries that created a lot of jobs. For example, Singapore's oil refining industry started when the Shell Refining Company Limited opened the island's first oil refinery at Pulau Bukom on the 26th of July, 1961. This, of course, was made possible due to the tax break. If you're wondering why Singapore didn't just start its own refinery, it's simple. They needed a sure thing, and they needed it fast. It's like this. If you need to make money fast and have the time and resources, would you A, start a fast food place with your brand and spend millions on marketing? Or B, buy a franchise like McDonald's or KFC, which already has a customer base and proven success? You'd go with the franchise, right? That's what Singapore did. The government also created an agency called the Economic Development Board, or EDB, in 1961. The EDB was in charge of putting the government's industrial policies into practice. They could give companies incentives, set up industrial estates, and even invest directly in new businesses. But the government also knew that they needed to improve the skills and education of Singaporean workers. So, in 1960, they launched a 5-year education plan to make sure workers had the skills needed in a modern economy. By 1965, these policies saw an increase in primary and secondary school enrollment of 33% and 94% respectively, a 70% increase in university enrollment, and the establishment of technical and vocational institutions with a total enrollment of nearly 1,200 students. These policies had some success. Real GDP grew at an annual rate of 5.3% between 1960 and 1965, and the share of manufacturing in real GDP rose to 19% from 17%. In addition, more than 21,000 new jobs were created in manufacturing. Nevertheless, the unemployment rate remained above 10%. That is because while this import substitution was a good plan, it was starting to show some cracks by the mid-1960s.
Tak mau ekonomi kita sangat terhimpit atau sangat tergantung dengan ekonomi.
One big issue in the import substitution strategy was that companies weren't making enough stuff, since they were only selling to a small number of people in Singapore and Malaysia for 2 years. They couldn't take advantage of something called economies of scale. Economies of scale means making more things to lower the cost of each item. Because they weren't making enough things efficiently, lots of people didn't have jobs in Singapore. On top of that, because they weren't exporting many goods, Singapore was having trouble with its balance of payments. So Singapore decided to make a big change. Instead of focusing on making things just for themselves, they decided to focus on exporting, but with a catch. They would ask global industries to set up shop in Singapore and produce their goods in Singapore, which would contribute to Singapore's exports. This new approach was called export-oriented industrialization. This was a pretty new idea at the time, and not many countries were doing this except maybe Hong Kong. To make this new export strategy happen, Singapore's Economic Development Board started looking for companies that would do so and pitched to them the perks of Singapore, like low wages, a good location in Asia, and good transportation. This made it attractive to foreign companies, especially multinational companies, who wanted to expand in the region, particularly those from the United States. The government incentivized companies to establish themselves in Singapore by lowering corporate taxes for exporters via the Economic Expansion Incentives Act. Foreign investment in Singapore increased due to factors like world trade growth and other Asian countries' difficulties in exporting clothes to the United States and the United Kingdom. The total manufacturing investment commitments during 1968 to 1973 exceeded 2.3 billion Singaporean dollars. Singapore's economy boomed due to an influx of foreign investment and a surge in exports. Manufacturing and finance spearheaded this growth, leading to increased job creation and higher wages. By the early 1970s, Singapore achieved near full employment, which meant that it was time for a change in strategy.
And what we lack in numbers, we will make up for in quality. In the standards of discipline, training, motivation and dedication, and leadership.
In the late 1960s, the focus had been on attracting investments that were labor and export intensive. But now, Singapore wanted to move into higher tech industries. They were no longer interested in just making textiles, clothes, basic electronics, and doing ship repair. These industries provided jobs, but they didn't require very advanced technology. Singapore wanted to move into more sophisticated industries like computers, electronics, machinery, and pharmaceuticals. These industries would allow them to create more value with the same number of workers. This shift was also necessary because wages were starting to rise in Singapore. This meant that manufacturing things there was becoming more expensive, and Singapore was beginning to lose some of its competitive edge against its neighbors. To encourage this shift, the Economic Development Board started encouraging foreign companies to invest in high-tech industries in Singapore. They did this by offering companies something called a tax holiday. Basically, they didn't have to pay taxes for the first 5 years of operation. Companies already in Singapore were also given incentives to upgrade their employees' skills, invest in new technology, and automate more of their processes. To make sure there were enough skilled workers, the Economic Development Board partnered with multinational companies to create special training centers. These centers provided hands-on training to workers, ensuring a steady supply of skilled workers for these companies. Even with this shift towards higher tech industries, Singapore's economy continued to grow quickly, and they still faced some labor shortages. Here you can see that the labor force participation rate increased significantly, particularly among women. Here you can see that the productivity levels were higher than real wages. This happens due to the globalization of low-level labor and tech advancements that upped productivity. But if this continued for long, it would lead to income inequality. So to battle this, the government introduced the wage correction policy in 1979. This was put forward by the National Wage Council, which recommended a general wage increase amounting to approximately 12% of average earnings, followed by even larger recommended increases in 1980 and 1981. The wage increase balanced out the income inequality to the point that wages surpassed the productivity level. All these policies helped to restructure Singapore's economy. By the mid-1980s, Singapore had become so technologically advanced that there wasn't much room left for improvement in manufacturing. This meant that they would need to come up with new policies to keep the economy growing.
The dream of wealth attracts everyone, but it is those who innovate in creating new products and services who will be the new rich.
In the early phases of Singapore's development, manufacturing was the star of the show. It grew faster than the overall economy. But between 1979 and 1984, things changed. Manufacturing growth slowed down to about 5% per year, while the overall economy grew at about 8.5% annually. This was because other sectors like business and financial services were taking off. So Singapore decided to diversify its economy to maintain growth. They incentivized biotechnology, computer peripherals, and aerospace companies to establish themselves in Singapore through tax breaks and other measures. The Monetary Authority of Singapore, or MAS, was in charge of promoting banking and financial services, while the Economic Development Board continued to promote other services. By the late 1980s, Singapore had become the disk drive production capital of the world, and Changi Airport, inaugurated in 1981, won the Airport of the Year award 12 times between 2000 and 24. However, this diversification strategy also had an impact on Singapore's relationship with its neighbors. Singapore was now a leader in high-tech, high-wage industries in Southeast Asia. This meant that foreign companies looking to invest in more labor-intensive, lower-wage industries were starting to look at other countries in the region. To make sure they didn't miss out, Singapore teamed up with Indonesia and Malaysia to create the Johor-Batam-Singapore Growth Triangle in 1989. The idea was that multinational companies could keep their high-skilled headquarters in Singapore while moving their labor-intensive manufacturing to lower-wage areas in Indonesia or Malaysia. This would benefit everyone involved. To encourage local companies to expand into foreign markets, the Economic Development Board and the Trade Development Board provided a range of incentives, including financial assistance loans, equity participation, grants, tax breaks, market information and facilitation, and support for training and development. These incentives resulted in substantial growth in foreign direct investment, which grew from 500 million in 1976 to 3.5 billion in 1989, with nearly 70% directed towards other Asian countries and over a third invested in Malaysia alone. The latest data analysis indicates that the implemented policy changes were a success. Looking back at how Singapore transformed its economy, we can see a clear pattern. They recognized what their economy needed, they created the right incentives to encourage it, and they fully supported those changes with smart policies and investments. And they've been doing this over and over again throughout their history. Even though Singapore has had a really strong economy, they've still faced some tough times. Think about the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the 2008 global financial crisis, the 2003 SARS epidemic, and the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. These events shook up the global economy. But here's the thing, Singapore was able to handle these crises pretty well. Why? Because they had been saving money for a rainy day, kind of like having a big emergency fund. They also had smart financial policies, which helped them avoid taking on too much debt. For years, the government has been saving money and building up reserves. This paid off when those crises hit. For example, during the 2008 global financial crisis, the government took 4.9 billion Singaporean dollars from those reserves to help support the economy. And it worked. In 2010, Singapore's economy bounced back with a growth rate of 10%, one of the fastest in the world. Because they recovered so strongly, they were able to put that amount back into their reserves. This shows how important it is for a country to have strong financial foundations. It's like having a safety net that allows you to bounce back from tough times. The key lesson here is that Singapore has consistently adapted to new challenges and opportunities, and the success they enjoy today didn't just come from policies and strategies. It came from the hardworking men and women who built Singapore with their own hands. It came from the teachers who nurtured curious minds and equipped them with the skills to thrive and serve. And it came from the leaders who governed with integrity and foresight.
And let there be no mistakes about this. Whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him.
And that is the legacy of Singapore, a nation built on the foundations of education, resilience, and honesty.
Having taken life and death decisions and gone through one acute crisis after another, my perspective, ambitions, priorities have undergone a fundamental and, I believe, a permanent transformation. For only a people who are willing to face up to their problems and are prepared to work with their leaders to meet unexpected hardships with courage and resolution. Only they deserve to thrive and to prosper.